Hey everyone, and welcome back to our APES flipped classroom for Unit 3, and we're beginning with our conversation about human populations. We've been talking about the way that animal populations grow and change and all the factors that impact animal populations, and now we're moving into discussions of human populations. So we're going to start with what we call age structure diagrams, or what are sometimes called population pyramids. Now you can see in this particular example that it doesn't look like a pyramid at all, but there are many of them that do. So this is an age structure diagram from the US from 2018. And let's talk just a little bit about what the age structure diagram tells us. So this gives us information about each different age, what we call age cohort. So that's a group of people of similar ages. And this particular one is in actual population. Sometimes you'll see these as percentages of the population. It's almost always going to be split between males and females, and it's going to give us an idea of how much of the population is in each age cohort. And we can use that information to tell us a lot about whether a population is growing, whether a population is stable, if it's growing, how quickly it's growing, or even if it is shrinking. So first look, let's talk about what we mean by this term age cohort. So what we're talking about is groups of similarly aged individuals. And so if you look at these graphs, we'll usually see that they're split into 4 to 5 year age groups. And then we tend to divide them again into 3 main categories. And those would be pre-reproductive age cohorts. So that's individuals from ages 0 to 14. Then what we consider the reproductive age cohort, which is 15 to 44. And while I recognize that here in the United States, we don't generally think of a 15-year-old as being of reproductive age. It certainly is the case in other parts of the world. And from a purely biological standpoint, that is a reproductive age. And then, of course, 45 and over, we consider to be the post-reproductive age cohort. And we split it this way because the number of people in each of those cohorts is going to tell us a lot, or really the proportion of people in each of those cohorts is going to tell us a lot about whether the population is growing, whether it's growing quickly, growing slowly, not growing, or has a stable population, or even has a declining population. So if we look at the difference between the first cohort, the pre-reproductive cohort, and the reproductive age cohort, if there is a larger pre-reproductive age cohort, that means that we have lots of current growth and we're going to have lots of future growth. If they're roughly equal, then that means that we're going to have slight growth or it's going to be stable. And if the 15 to 44 or the reproductive age group is larger, that means that we're going to have a declining population. So why is that? If we think about what that means, if we have lots of people of pre-reproductive age, that means that as they reach reproductive age, they're going to be having more children. And so our population is going to be growing quickly because the people are reaching reproductive age and reproducing. If we have a less extreme pyramid, so still 0 to 15 or that pre-reproductive age cohort is larger, our population is growing, but it's growing more slowly. And then, of course, if we have equal proportions of pre-reproductive age and reproductive age, then that's considered to be a stable population. It's not growing, but it's also not shrinking. And then if we have fewer in the younger age cohort, the pre-reproductive age cohort, that means that as our population ages, there are going to be fewer people reaching reproductive age, and so the population is actually shrinking. So we can see that these often correlate with the development level of the countries. So if we look very often, and we'll talk about demographic transition in the next couple of days, but countries that are considered developing countries are usually in this cohort of expanding rapidly. Populations are expanding very rapidly. So those would be places like Guatemala, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, Mexico. Countries that are expanding more slowly would be countries like ours, the United States, Australia, even China. China sometimes falls into this expanding slowly category, sometimes falls into the stable category. And we'll talk about some of the societal pressures that come in here as well. Stable populations tend to be very developed countries, so countries that are past their industrial stage, or what we consider post-industrial. So countries like Japan, Italy, or Greece. And then you have countries with declining populations, again, post-industrial. These would be countries like Germany and Russia and even Bulgaria. So we should be able to recognize these pyramids, but we should not only be able to recognize them, we should be able to explain why they indicate the type of growth that they indicate. Okay, so let's practice reading some of these diagrams. So if we look at the population pyramid or the age structure diagram for India, we can see that their pre-reproductive cohort is larger than their reproductive cohort. And so we know that this is a country with a rapidly growing population. If we look at the United States, our pre-reproductive cohort and our reproductive cohort are very similar. So this is going to be very stable. And if we look at Germany and China, particularly Germany, we can see that the pre-reproductive cohort is smaller than the reproductive cohort. And so this is a country with a shrinking population. If we look, this one is actually in population size, not in percent of population. So when we look at the number of individuals, we can see that there are vastly more individuals in India and China than in the United States and Germany. Okay, so our little FRQ practice for today, I would like you to take a look at these three population pyramids or age structure diagrams. I want you to identify the country with the slowest population growth rate, and then I want you to explain your answer. So remember, focus in on what those cohorts tell us and what the relationship of the cohorts tell us in order to explain your answer. Okay, so from age structure diagrams, we lead into what we call total fertility rate, usually abbreviated TFR. And if we look, so total fertility rate is just the number of children that an average woman will have over her lifetime, or total average number of children per woman over her lifetime. And this graph doesn't cover a lot of time. So you can see this graph begins in 1950, and you can see the number of children drops off a little bit, has a slight peak here between the 1960 and 1970, and then it starts to drop down as we move into 2015. And this is the world total fertility rate. This is not just the United States. So I want you to think about what's going on in the world between 1950 and 2015, and think about what are some of the factors that you think contribute to this change in total fertility rate. Okay, so first let's talk about what total fertility rate is. This is the average number of children a woman in a particular population will bear throughout her lifetime. Countries that have high total fertility rates generally have higher birth rates and higher population growth rates. On the other hand, we're also going to talk about infant mortality, or what we call infant mortality rate. And when we talk about infant mortality rate, we are talking about the number of deaths of children under the age of 1 per 1,000 people in a population. We also talk about child mortality rate, and that's the number of deaths of children under the age of 5 per 1,000 people in a population. In less developed countries, this infant mortality rate tends to be significantly higher because of the lack of access to good, nutritious food, to clean water, to healthcare. Countries that have a higher infant mortality rate also tend to have a higher total fertility rate because families have more children in order to have more children survive. And this was true in the US in our past. We tended to have higher fertility rates because of the mortality rate. And that's certainly something you will have discussed in your history classes. But in modern times, our less developed countries, because of the higher infant mortality rates, tend to have higher total fertility rates. And both of those numbers play into what we call replacement level fertility. So replacement level fertility is the number of children a woman would need to have throughout her lifetime in order to offset the deaths in a population and keep that population size stable. So it's really, what would the total fertility rate be in order to offset deaths? And so in developed countries, it's just over 2. You're basically, each woman really needs to replace herself and her spouse. In less developed countries, because of that higher infant mortality rate, because of the higher child mortality rate, and then again, in developed countries, a lot of the time with war and conflict and famine, that number tends to be much higher because it's needed to offset a higher death rate. So globally, if we look at total fertility rate, you can see that there is a strong correlation between total fertility rate and infant mortality. So generally speaking, the higher the infant mortality rate, the higher the total fertility rate as well. So if we look at infant mortality rate, this is just in from 1990 to 2017. So these aren't great charts to put side by side because one begins in 1990, this one begins in 1950. But if you start here in 1990 and you compare these two charts, you can see that the infant mortality rate from 1990 to 2017 drops dramatically by more than half. And so why is infant mortality rate declining? Access to clean water, access to nutritious food, access to healthcare. Those are the 3 main things that decrease infant mortality rates. And probably number 1 among them is the access to clean water. So we can see that as infant mortality rate drops, so does TFR. Of course, there are other factors that influence total fertility rate. One of them is the development level of the nation or the country in which people live. This has to do with affluence. Our more wealthy nations have a lower total fertility rate than less developed nations. So why might that be? Well, in more developed nations, women are much more likely to be educated, which means they're going to have more economic opportunity. And as they have more economic opportunity and higher levels of education, they're more likely to plan their families in a way that doesn't affect their careers. They have higher access to family planning tools, to contraceptives. They also tend to delay their first pregnancies so that they have begin reproduction later in life. And of course, in developed countries, there's not a need for children to be part of the workforce. So they're not laboring as agricultural labor on farms. And so that also means that there are fewer children, or families have fewer children. Other factors that influence total fertility rate are government policy. This can be coercive, meaning that it is an enforced policy, or it can be an encouraging or a non-coercive policy. So you can have forced sterilization in some countries, you have voluntary sterilization in some countries. Some countries have policies that limit the number of children that a family can have. China's one-child policy is a great example of that. That's now a two-child policy, but it definitely was a coercive policy. Now, it was not something that was enforced by jail time or by taking children away, but it was a heavy fine for families that had more than one child, and frequently beyond the ability of the family to pay. Now, when we talk about encouraging policies, sometimes countries will have tax incentives for having fewer children, or they'll give loans to women to start businesses if they don't have children. So they're encouraging a lower fertility rate. So we can have coercive, or we can have encouraging. Carrot and stick. Affluence, it makes a huge difference. Okay, the more access women have to contraceptives and to family planning, that always comes along with affluence. And so that tends to decrease the total fertility rate. Educational opportunities, economic opportunities, they take time, and sometimes it is a choice of women to prioritize education or economic success over having children. And then, of course, in more affluent countries or more affluent areas, we tend to have much lower infant mortality rates, which leads to a lower total fertility rate. Better education means fewer unplanned pregnancies. So as education increases, total fertility rate decreases. There's also more job opportunities. So women have alternatives to simply getting married young. There are options to have careers, to become educated, to not simply be a wife and mother. Okay, so I told you at the beginning that I wanted you to think about think about what might have caused this decrease in worldwide total fertility rate. So your FRQ for this section is to identify and discuss 2 of the causes for this trend in worldwide total fertility rate. Okay. That's it for today. As always, if you have any questions, let me know. I look forward to seeing you in class tomorrow.